Welcome to this edition of Under the Radar for Saturday, March 25th. Now, although the purpose of Under the Radar is to bring you stories you may have missed during the week, I don't think I can avoid this week's events in London, but I will try to take a different angle from a lot of the mainstream commentary. So as you know, a religiously inspired psycho mowed down pedestrians in his car of peace and then jumped out and stabbed a policeman to death. The current death toll is 4, with more than 50 injured. And of course that set off the usual chain of events: condemnation of the attack and condolences for victims by world leaders, a commitment to the values of freedom and democracy, and the all too familiar #activism. Now, I don't know why stuff like this bothers me so much, but it just does. Most people probably think this is a reasonable reaction. At least 6,000 thought so. But I don't. I understand that if you were walking across Westminster Bridge and a car starts mowing people down in front of you, that would be incredibly shocking. But when you've had time to absorb what happened and feel the need to tweet this out, I can only conclude that you've either been asleep for the past couple of decades or you're just engaging in some virtue signalling. Let's get this straight. You're shocked that a terrorist attack was carried out in a major European city. I mean, it's not like that's never happened before, or that the UK terrorist threat level has been set to severe for some time now. But I guess we shouldn't be too harsh. Expressing shock is not the worst offence. After all, you could instead tweet out your admiration for the diversity of the victims, like this complete and utter moron. And of course, we hear the usual reminders that not all Muslims are terrorists, although those same people probably won't acknowledge that almost all terrorists are Muslims, and that we should be aware of retaliation from right-wing extremist groups. Yeah, that should be at the top of our list of priorities. But all this just distracts from the kinds of important conversations that should be happening. And of course, a lot of this depends on where you live in the world. But I would say that immigration and integration are the topics that should be at the top of the list. Not in Canada, though. They continue their cuckening by passing Bill M103 that focuses on condemning Islamophobia. And not to be outdone, the Victorian government here in Australia is threatening to make it harder to criticise Islam by reviewing the Victorian Racial and Religious Tolerance Act in response to proposed changes to Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. Oh, Victoria, have you no shame? Now, immigration and integration are inseparable, but I think that immigration is a bigger worry in countries like Germany than it is for Australia and the US. But integration, or the lack thereof, is a big problem for both. Although again, if you have immigration at the unprecedented rate that Germany's having, then integration is practically impossible. You're going to end up with parallel societies. So what do you do about it? Well, if you're in Germany, I don't know if there is much you can do about it. I think you're going to have big problems for decades to come. But the first thing you could obviously do is stop taking people in. In the US, Donald Trump has proposed a temporary ban on people coming from certain majority Muslim countries, and in Australia, Pauline Hanson has reiterated her call for a ban in the wake of the London attack. Now, undoubtedly, many of you will disagree, but I don't think a ban is the best way to go about it. But I don't see how you can avoid having some type of religious test for potential immigrants and refugees. Governments can keep pretending religion has nothing to do with it, but the public are sick of hearing about the religion of peace. They know this is not true, and they want something to be done about it. Here's Sam Harris articulating that view in conversation with Maajid Nawaz recently.
This is kind of a gut reaction that I know millions upon millions of people are having to things like what we just saw in Germany, the recent atrocity at the Christmas market, right? So you have a Tunisian immigrant who murders a truck driver and runs his truck into a crowd of people, and I think was it 12 who died in the end? I don't know if any.
About 50 injured, yeah.
Okay.
Roughly.
So you see something like this, and this is happening in the context of this wave of immigration coming into Europe largely by virtue of the war in Syria, although there are other reasons. And there's just the brute fact that 100% of jihadists are Muslim, right? These are not the Amish, they're not the Scientologists, they're not the Anglicans. If you take a community of Muslims from Syria or Iraq or any other country on earth and place them in the heart of Europe, you are importing, by definition, some percentage, however small, of radicalized people or people who will be prone to radicalism at some future date where they just decide to start watching too many Anwar al-Awlaki videos. It's just, and this, again, this only happens to Muslims or people who are likely to become Muslim, right? So you see this massacre in the Christmas market, and I think many people will feel, what is the fucking point of having more Muslims in your society? It seems perfectly rational to say, we don't want any more. We have enough, right? And certainly increasing the percentage is not a help to anyone who loves freedom of speech and anything else, any of the other liberal values that you and I just spoke about maximizing. It's not worth the trouble. And if we can figure out some way to keep the number of Muslims down in any society, whether we're honest about this or whether we do this covertly, clearly it's rational to want to do this.
And let me put some more numbers around that concern here in Australia. Australia's Justice Minister Michael Keenan says our security agencies have stopped 12 terrorist plots in 2.5 years and charged nearly 60 people, all Muslims. We also learnt this week that 500 Iraqi and Syrian refugees bound for Australia in the past year have been refused entry after their names were found on an international security watch list. Many were simply criminals, but at least 30 were on ASIO's National Security Terrorism Watch List, with more red flagged by other intelligence agencies. But the left keeps protesting about not taking in more refugees and why we're not doing it faster. Idiots. Now, the Australian government is not publicly acknowledging that it is discriminating against Muslims in its refugee program, but the claims in this article suggest that it is. Quote, "But how many Australians must die for the rest of us to be able to boast that we're free of prejudice and anti-Muslim bigotry? The Turnbull government has quietly made that calculation and concluded too many of us have died already. It has made sure that the overwhelming majority, perhaps 3/4 of the 12,000 refugees we are taking in from Iraq and Syria, are Christians, and others are from other non-Muslim faiths, although publicly it hotly denies it screened out Muslims. But privately, the government knows it could not afford to ignore faith when deciding who to let in." Exactly right. Now, I understand that the United States Constitution forbids a religious test for citizenship, but you cannot ignore the fact that religion is a factor. So how do you deal with it? Here's Sam Harris again commenting on that same idea.
It's hard to get away from the logic of some kind of religious test. It is actually relevant once you realize you're looking for jihadists. It is relevant to know whether somebody is a Salafi Muslim, right? Because he would stand more of a chance of being a jihadist than a Unitarian Universalist would. But the way Maajid talks about this, we just want to know about people's beliefs and attitudes, right? We're looking for illiberal beliefs. And yes, it is true that Islam has more than its fair share of people who are fundamentally illiberal at this moment, who don't support free speech, who think apostates should be killed, say. But we are looking for illiberalism of that sort in general. And if there's some new cult born tomorrow that produces the same kind of illiberalism, well, then we'd want to stop those people at the border too, if we could. So a Muslim ban doesn't make any sense. But nor does it make any sense to say you can't ask people detailed questions about their worldview in the process of vetting them. Of course you have to ask people, how would you feel if your daughter married outside your religion, say? And there's a wrong answer to that question. If you say, well, I would cut her head off, we don't want you in the country, right? And we are right not to want you in the country. And it's instructive that there are Muslim organizations that don't want those sorts of questions asked in the vetting process. Of course, as a very common theme with me, this comes down to ideas and beliefs and the degree to which people subscribe to them, because this is the best predictor of what they will do in the world. And we care about what people will do and how likely they are to assimilate into our society in a productive way. And we're right to care about those things.
So maybe you get around a religious test by having more of a stringent values test. I don't know, I'm not a lawyer. Perhaps that's naive, but something has to change. The public is going to ask the same questions that were posed in the previous article. How many more terrorist attacks and how many more dead bodies are going to pile up before we drop our pious stance towards religious impartiality? In Australia, the government appears to be taking a small step in that direction. The Prime Minister's recent statement on multiculturalism accentuates values and integration, a departure from the last statement put out by the Gillard government. Quote, in a landmark departure from the 2011 statement delivered by then Prime Minister Julia Gillard, the Turnbull government has included for the first time a list of individual freedoms, including freedom of speech, as core Australian values. The statement released to the Australian ahead of its launch today is a rejection of multiculturalism as a vehicle for grievance and identity politics. The government has dropped past emphasis on equitable access to welfare and services for new migrants and instead promotes values of opportunity, self-reliance and aspiration. Well, those are the kind of noises you want to hear out of the government, but for the moment, they're just words. Now, in light of the Canadian passage of Bill M103 that focuses on condemning Islamophobia and the aforementioned Victorian government here in Australia seeking to bolster its Racial and Religious Tolerance Act for essentially the same reason, I wanted to share a recent paper on the topic of Islamophobia. Now, I don't think we should give credence to this ridiculous term Islamophobia, since it is, after all, an invention of Islamist groups for the express intention of preventing criticism of their faith. But as it's frequently invoked as a reason for extra protection under the law, I think this research paper is relevant. So the researchers wanted to distinguish between general anti-Muslim prejudice that is chalked up to xenophobic attitudes from a prejudice against illiberal values such as the treatment of women or attitudes towards homosexuals by Muslims. So they devised two experiments, and I'll just talk about one because the results were the same for both. So in the first experiment, they asked three groups of respondents who were all Belgian whether they would help a student complete a simple task. For one group, the student was non-Muslim. In the other group, the student was Muslim. And in the third group, the student was Muslim with the added condition that the task they wanted help with was to protest against a headscarf ban. And the researchers found that there was no significant difference between helping a Muslim and a non-Muslim when the task was neutral. However, people were significantly less inclined to help the Muslim who wanted to protest the headscarf ban. So the basic upshot of the study was that prejudice against Muslims was only demonstrated when there was a perception of illiberal values at play. And I think that resonates well with what we see in most Western countries. People are not prejudiced against Muslims simply because they're Muslim, but because of a conflict of values. Now, it's only one study, but I think it's an extra piece of ammunition against the Islamophobia case. Anyway, that's going to do it for this week's Under the Radar. Let me know what you think of this week's content. And as always, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, or consider supporting the channel on Patreon. See you next time.